Welcome back to another episode of Chasing Frets, and my name is Jason Shadrick, and I'm here joined again by Andy Ellis.
Hello, everyone.
And as you heard on Monday, we have Matt Smith, who's a guitarist, producer, educator based out of Austin, Texas. He runs the Six String Ranch down there in Austin, which is an incredible studio. And he hosts, at least pre-COVID times, I'm sure he'll return to it. He also hosts workshops there with well-known guitar players and does a lot of studio and session work there. And that dovetails into our topic today, which is what are some ways to, either on stage or in the studio, to combine different guitar sounds so they don't just end up in a jumbled, muddy mess.
We're going to learn a lot because Matt has a lot of experience in layering guitars and as a producer listening to people who layer guitars, maybe with less success. So he tells us what to avoid and also what to do.
Yeah, and so we cover not only technique stuff, but also sonic EQ things that could really help, even if you're just at home recording some demos for your buddies. So check it out. You can reach out to us at chasingfrets@premierguitar.com. So without any more, let's just hop into our next conversation with Matt Smith.
Segovia once called the guitar a little orchestra. And as I was studying classical guitar at the beginning of all this grand adventure of six strings, I tried to look at the guitar that way and see it as a little orchestra. And then, as I began to meet other musicians and play electric guitar, I realized that this little orchestra can be shifted with capos and shifted with open tunings, and you can play nylon string, 6-string, 12-string. You can have different scale lengths. All of a sudden, these colors that are still part of guitar are available to us on a palette. But as we all probably remember from kindergarten, if you mix the wrong colors together, you get this kind of ucky, dirt-colored thing. You'd think blue and yellow, it's beautiful with red, and pretty soon you're making mud. And I know, Matt, that you've been arranging and producing and mixing music for a long time, and you've even told me that sometimes people who are guitarists give you music to mix where all the guitars are kind of making that mud color. What do you tell them? What do you tell other guitarists to do and also not to do with this guitar orchestra?
Someone said something to me a long time ago, and I never forgot, and I'll start with this. It was a guy in New York, and he was listening to my music, and he said to me, "What's the best part of your song?" And it kind of took me I wasn't quite prepared for it. And I thought about it, and I said, maybe this hook right here. And he said, "Why isn't the rest of it that good?" And I thought, everything has to be the best part of the song. So for me, I think when you're making music, when you're recording music and playing music, everything is an opportunity to make things better. So if you already have, for example, one of the things that I mentioned to you before about this, if the guitar is playing open position chords, the other guitar doesn't have to play those open position chords. They can play them in a different part of the neck. They can also play a different rhythm. So it's not just the voicings, looking for different voicings, but looking for different rhythms. So I've always looked at the guitar as a subdivision of a drum kit. So it all starts with the kick drum. For example, a bass, it has to lock in with the kick drum. If the bass is going boom, 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 the bass line can go doom, 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 and then you automatically have a great rhythm. Over the top of that, you have, so I'm looking at the smallest subdivision, which is a 16th note. 1E and a 2E and a 3E and a 4E and a 1E and a 2E and a 3E and a 4E. And then within that, we got doom, 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 doom. And then we have little holes. So maybe the guitar doesn't need to be all over the place. I used to always call bands that I worked with sometimes that were like funk bands that everyone was playing all over the place. I'd be like, I love you guys. You're like a box of puppies. Box of puppies is great for like 10 minutes, and then you have to put the box of puppies down because you'd much rather hang out with the old dog that knows where to place this stuff right. In other words, if the bass line is busy, make the guitar line, it might just be the guitar line, it might just be an E ninth chord going diddle-diddle-diddle-diddle, like doom, 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 diddle-diddle-diddle-doom. You know what I mean? That might be all you need on the guitar there. Now, if there's another guitar going over that, it might be doom, 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 doom. So in other words, I think about arranging rhythmically and sonically the guitars so that it creates a whole. A great example of this, it's super old school, but it is to listen to the Thank You for Letting Me Be Myself by Sly and the Family Stone. Listen to just the one guitar part. There's the bass line that goes doom, 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 doom. And the guitar is going do, 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 do. That's one guitar. Do, 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 do. The other one goes beetle it, and that's all it does. And that makes it so funky and so cool. Now with rock and metal, you have a lot of down-tuned guitars and stuff. So if something's already holding down the bass, is in that lower bass register, the more things you add to that, there's a lot to be done with mixing and stuff, but you have to remember the bass and the kick drum share the same sonic frequencies. Guitars tend to be low-mid. So keeping a lot of guitars in the same register, or you can make something really, that's how they did it with AC/DC, for example, is layering the same parts on top of one another. But even if you are going to layer the same parts, it's really important not to use the same guitar. Mm-hmm. For example, you might have one humbucker guitar and then another guitar doubling that with, for example, a telly, a much thinner sound that you can pan them left and right and make them much fatter. But the worst thing you can do is to have the same guitar playing the same thing over and over and over again, taking up all the space from the vocal. If the vocal is a tenor, you want to stay away from that particular frequency with the guitars, and you want to have space for the vocals to live. So for me, it's really about different voicings and different rhythms for each part.
One more question about... or one more thought about this layering guitar idea that sort of dovetails to the home studio. And so you have one person making these different guitar parts. If you had Tom Petty, you have Tom Petty playing his 12-string, and you have Mike Campbell, so you have two different human beings, and they're going to play in different places, and they can separate. What's the hardest thing for one musician who's doing all the tracking on guitar to bear in mind? What do you have to remember as you layer your guitars?
There's another really simple philosophical statement, and I'll say this. What would you say to you if you were listening to your stuff? And generally, if you take yourself out of being inside, we all get so deeply inside of things. That's why it's so important a lot of times to have a producer. I never produced my own music for years and years until I was just explaining to everyone else what I wanted them to do, and then I started producing myself. But but I learned from listening to a lot of other producers and asking questions about why this works and why that didn't, for example. And if you, again, I'm going to go back to the idea of removing yourself from the equation and looking at it from the standpoint of the listener. If you're listening to this, you're like, okay, one of the biggest problems musicians have when they're recording themselves at home is either they don't know when to stop or they don't know when to continue. In other words, that really wasn't good enough, do it again, or you should really have stopped on take number 14. As a producer, a lot of times, for example, let me discuss soloing. So a lot of times, I find that most guitar players, not every guitar player, especially not on the pro level, but a lot of aspiring guitar players aren't really playing their guitar. The guitar plays them. What I mean by that is they're wiggling their fingers around in a pattern they were taught that will work, and they know it works, but they're not necessarily playing what they mean to play. Now, we're communicating with our voice. I always teach people to sing everything they play. And the reason being, there's two things that happens. A, you become a much better singer. Two, you start to understand what's going to come out of your instrument. I'll explain why. For example, there's musicians that I've worked with, very good guitar players, that'll say, all right, I'm going to take a solo, and I'll go, great, I'm going to go leave and just let you do your thing. I'll put it on loop record, go ahead and play it. And then if they start to melt down, I'll come in and I'll say, okay, you've done 13 takes of a solo, and you're not happy with any of them. Now I can comp a solo for you by taking little pieces of everything. Or let me ask you this, what do you want to play? And they'll go, what do you mean? I'll go, sing to me what you want to play. And then they'll sing me a line, and I'll say, well, play that. And they'll go, oh, that makes perfect sense. Yeah. What happens is we tend to be reactionary a lot of times as guitar players instead of intentional. There's a huge difference in intentional guitar playing, and most of the guitar players that we all love are very intentional in their guitar playing. In other words, that's exactly what they meant to play. And you achieve that by tying your voice to your guitar. It's how we interface with the rest of the world with our voice. So it makes sense if you want your guitar to go. If you sing it, if you're singing with your guitar, it's much easier to make that happen. So that's what I mean by intentional guitar playing.
So I know on Monday we talked about different strategies for dealing with different fretted and non-fretted instruments coming from a guitarist perspective. How would you approach, we talked about capos, different voicings. How would you add in different tunings to the mix to help expand the sonic fingerprint of the guitars?
There's, for example, if a song is in D, and I understand this structure of D. In other words, I've already worked out that major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished, major pattern on D tuning that I've extrapolated as we discussed on Monday. Then I can just easily find, for example, the G chord in D tuning and use that. However, I won't play the same thing. Maybe I'll just use what they call diamonds, which is just whole notes. And let that ring over it, maybe with tremolo or something, or some interesting effect. But the whole thing is when you're, and that allows me to decide when I'm going to use these particular guitars. So in other words, I have that particular instrument, or I might use high-strung guitar, which is a great thing to use a lot of times. High-strung is as simple as this. You take a 12-string set, and you take the low strings off the 6th, 5th, 4th, and 3rd, and then you have the octave of E, A, D, and G with a normal B and E string. That's a beautiful thing to layer in on acoustic guitar tracks. That's a wonderful texture. It's kind of a secret weapon. And then, for example, the baritone tuning. You can use baritone strings. You can buy baritone electric strings and put them on a regular guitar. You don't need a baritone guitar unless you're going to go up above the 7th fret or so, in which case you start to have intonation problems. But you can string your guitar with anything you want. And so really it's about textures, so a lot of times I'll just tune my guitar to whatever it needs to be and then just tune it back after I'm done so I don't mess up the neck. But I've always felt it's really important for you to be the boss of your instrument and not for your instrument to be the boss of you. Mm-hmm. What I mean by that is your ability to understand what it is that you're hearing. For example, I'll put it this way. When we start playing, if I played you a D chord, you would know it's a D chord because you've heard it a million times. This is what I try to explain to students, for example, is like, if you're going to play what you have to do is start to understand what it is that you're hearing. What is that sound? What is it? What I was hearing? One of the things I used to do at the National Guitar Workshop when I taught there for many years, because I'd have a class for 6 hours, and at the end of the 6 hours, because everyone's totally burnt out, I'd say, today we're going to do What the Heck Are They Doing? Where you can bring me in anything, and I'll explain to you what they're doing and why they're doing it. And my students would have a great time trying to stump me. and they couldn't stump me. I go, that's Steve Vai with a whammy pedal, and that's how he's getting that really cool. This is what he's playing, only it's an octave higher than what I'm playing because he's got the whammy pedal down. That's what's going on. And he's playing that scale because it fits into it this way. And so I'd explain to them why it is and why you're doing it. So the idea with all of this is, first of all, to understand what it is that you want to hear so that you can make it happen on whatever you're doing. Mm-hmm. I hope that was clear. I don't know if that was clear or not.
Oh, yeah. And So when it comes, so I'm just thinking like we've been talking mostly about kind of studio tips and tricks, but when it comes to like live settings, when there's another guitar player in your band, and I run in this to a lot with the other guitar players in my band, is we have a fairly simple harmonic song, and I just keep trying to push myself to find like when I look over the other guitar players, if I see their hand at the third fret, I stay as far away from the third fret as I can. Are there certain tips and tricks that for gigging guitar players that things they could pull out on the fly that would help them create space in their guitar parts?
Well, that's the key word, is space.
Yeah.
So what happens, we have a tendency as musicians to want to fill all the space. But yet, for example, if you have a simple song and the drums going doom, check, doom, doom, check, doom, check, and the guitars, one strumming guitar is going strum, 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 strum. That's taken care of. So maybe I'm playing something of voicing. Maybe what happens a lot of times, because we have 6 strings, doesn't mean we should use all 6 strings all the time. I learned a long time ago from all my years in New York, especially playing with piano players, don't play full chords, play partial chords. For example, I might only play a few strings, maybe just the second, third, and fourth strings. If the low end is being taken care of by the acoustic guitar player or the other electric guitar player, I might just play a little, just a partial chord, and then use a more interesting rhythm that creates a vibe for the song. What happens a lot of times is we tend to look at music as what I call a staple. In other words, the song starts. It maintains the same dynamic all the way through. The song ends. To me, that's not good music. Or you're losing an opportunity to build things. Your song starts. It might just be the acoustic guitarist and the vocal that starts the song instead of the whole band playing. And then another guitar adds. So in other words, I've always felt like to build certain songs that will work like this, the arrangement of things by not using everything you have right from the start. A lot of times when I'm arranging a band, and also I look at this as live. So what happens a lot of times, you have the acoustic guitar playing, the song starting, then the drums and the bass kick in, and then with that, and then I can add an interesting acoustic or electric guitar track. And then as it goes, maybe the chorus comes in and things get heavier. And then it drops back down again. So instead of having this, what I call the staple effect, song starts, it's the full dynamic, and then it ends. Then you have this much more of a beautiful, what happens when you pull back in music? People start to lean into you. And then you can smack them in the head a little bit with a little loud note or something, or a little interesting, hit. So that makes music exciting for me. It's being very aware of dynamics and very aware of arrangement. Does everything have to, because you have a guitar in your hand, it's okay not to play it for the first third of the song.
So to wrap up, that's great advice, Matt. To wrap up, I want you to, and I'll put you on the spot here, I want you to point to maybe a couple songs or a couple albums that you think of in your mind when you think of really well crafted arrangements and layered guitars.
Wild Horses by the Rolling Stones. That was a classic one. Starts off with just the acoustic guitar, and it kind of builds and builds and builds. By the end of the song, it's great. Let me think what else. Some of the Led Zeppelin stuff. I'm 61 years old, so listeners, you have to understand. I listen to all kinds of music. Another great one, for example, I would say is Kiko by Los Lobos. Their music for them that's like an amazingly arranged music, really imaginative use of stuff. Yeah. I think it's really important to look outside of what you ordinarily play. If you're like playing in a rock band, maybe you should listen to some more acoustic music and just be inspired by that. If you play acoustic music, perhaps you should listen to world music. In other words, music from around the world, to search for textures, particularly for rhythms. That's why I was so attracted to Los Lobos when I first heard them, or other bands like that, because the rhythms were not familiar to me. And I'm like, I love that groove. It's like when I first heard Santana, I'm like, they caught on fire primarily because of those rhythms that people hadn't heard back then. It's the same thing you have now with bands like Wolfpack. Or these other bands, because it's super. Now that music has been around forever. like super hardcore funk has been around for a long time, but it's being rediscovered by a new generation because of the virtuosity of the band and because of how tight that is. There's a sense to, and that's exactly what I'm talking about. Razor tight interaction of parts.
And I remember in grad school, one of my favorite classes I took were the arranging classes. And I did one semester on like jazz combo and one semester on big band. And when you talk about seeing how all these parts together, even in that rhythmic example you were singing earlier, seeing it on kind of a broad spectrum with 16 musicians in a group, that to me taught me more about part interaction and dynamics and variety within an arrangement than almost listening to big band music and than almost anything I've ever done.
And that was very revelatory for you, I'm sure. You hadn't really thought of music like that before. And what about you, Andy? What was that for you?
Well, yes, big band, and I did go to Berkeley, so I got to see it as a young person, you know, in the flesh, if you will. And it's one thing to listen to a record, and it's another thing to sit. I wasn't playing in the big band. You had to be pretty good to be able to qualify to play in the Berkeley Big Band. But, you know, you're 4 feet away from horns, and damn, I mean, that is loud. That's, you know, that gets up close to a little over 100 dB, you know, when they start to punch. But also symphonic music, the same thing. If you go listen to live symphony, then you hear the colors, and then you get these weird colors that fall way outside of what we normally use. You know, the piccolos, for goodness sake, way up there, the piccolos, or the little chimey percussion things, you know, and they only come in, you know, 17 minutes into the piece for 8 bars.
That's brilliant. One of my great experiences, I got a call one day. I was actually in New Orleans, and I got a call to come up to Carnegie Hall and play with the New York Pops at a concert, and sitting, and it was James Bond, and they needed somebody to play those James Bond guitar parts. I'm like, sure, and they're like, you know, so luckily I was able to read enough that I was able to just walk in and do it, but sitting in the middle of an orchestra and listening to it like that was mind-blowing. Like sitting there in the middle of an orchestra, 77-piece orchestra, and you're just listening to all the different parts. I was in complete awe of the power of that. And so, you know, all of those experiences, I hope a lot of these listeners get a chance to really go outside the normal things that they listen to, because if you keep listening to, for example, to Swedish death metal, for example, and if you keep listening, the music you write is going to sound like all the other music that you listen to. If you always listen for different influences and try to get as many different influences, it's a much longer path, but you'll come up with something much more original, I think.
Well, I think that's a great way to end today's episode. Matt, thanks again for hanging. Always good to get some time and learn some stuff from you. So join us back again on Friday when we have Matt Smith returning. So we'll talk then.